Welcome everyone to the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Special Educational Needs and our meeting today. My name is Olivia Blake. I'm the Labour MP for Sheffield Hallam and I'm privileged to be the chair of the APPG for SEND. We're a group of MPs from different political parties who have come together because we want to try and improve the education for children and young people with SEND. We don't have direct power to make changes or answer your questions, as we are not the government nor the Department of Education, but we will try and have some influence. This is the 5th meeting of the APPG and the 3rd as part of our autumn inquiry into how transitions in education for young people and children with SEND have been impacted by COVID-19. Each meeting has been focusing on a different broad area of need as identified by the SEND Code of Practice. This meeting will look at the experience of children and young people with social, emotional and mental health difficulties. An agenda for today's meeting is on our website and the link is going to be posted in the chat room if you've not seen it already. For the meeting today, we have Jackie and Jenny, who are our BSL interpreters, and the meeting will be available to watch again tomorrow, and the video will also be captioned. I would like to say a huge thank you to our speakers for joining us today to share their experiences and expertise. We will hear from 5 speakers and then MPs will have an opportunity to ask questions. Attendees, unfortunately, due to time constraints, will not be able to ask questions. We invite everyone to make written contributions to our inquiry. Whether you're a parent, a young person, a charity organisation or school, we want to amplify your voice. The deadline for submitting your contributions is this weekend, on November the 15th. The findings will be made public and shared with the Secretary of State for the Department of Education and the Education Select Committee. The terms of reference of the inquiry are available on the website, which will be posted in the chat room, but it is www.naht.org.uk/APPGSEND. Please tweet around this meeting with the hashtag APPGSEND, and you can follow the APPG on our Twitter handle, which is @APPG_SEND. We'll now move to a hearing from today's speakers. So I would just ask that any MP that does want to ask a question, please introduce yourself, just for the benefit of our BSL interpreters as well. So over to our first speaker, who I'm really pleased to welcome, which is Dominic. He's an autistic young person from London. Dominic attends an autism-specific school, Middlesex. He is currently studying towards his GCSEs. His favourite subjects at school are maths and PE, and at home he enjoys watching The Chase on ITV and spending time with his family. Welcome, Dominic.
Thank you very much indeed. It's an absolute pleasure to be attending today's meeting. I'm here to talk about how my mental health and well-being has been during 2020 and throughout the period of the coronavirus pandemic. So how my mental health has been during 2020 so it hasn't been too easy. It's been slightly grim, particularly in the beginning of the March lockdown. So that was when we were really going to go into draconian measures, when we all have to quarantine ourselves in our homes, and we can be able to do a lot of the things we always love doing in our lives, in addition to going about with business, like heading to school or work. And what we're doing to help with our mental health this year at school is we do a lot of things that help us with our mental health along with our well-being. So we do activities like deep breathing, mindfulness every form time prior to beginning our lessons, after awards and break, in addition to doing compy reading from 10:50 to 11 a.m. So that is after like our first awards and all. And how school influenced my mental health, it came out pretty positive. When we returned in September for the first time since March, the newly adapted routine, especially when we So the newly adapted routine, so like staying in our form rooms, washing our hands when entering, keeping our distance, especially as we're making a lot of readaptations due to COVID. It took some good amount of time getting settled into, and what really got me smiling is seeing my teachers along with my peers and classmates, especially as I haven't seen them in person in 6 months. Till September. And so what's changed about learning at school this year is there isn't a lot of difference when it comes to being at school, but there are a few differences, obviously, because we've had to readapt a lot because of this current circumstances. So we pupils and the teachers, especially, have been more distance apart than usual, and the community itself, we are now split up into 2 groups. We call them sittings here. So that's for like rewards, breaks, lunch, etc., and things like that. So much is working well after having to make those changes, which is inevitably due to the circumstances of the pandemic. So we've now incorporated regular hand washing into, our timetable. And of course, we keep our distance. And now we're taking advantage of multiple entrances and exits for space in the community. So for drop off and pick up, we now use gates. We don't just have one entrance. We've now got 3 gates in total on our site. And like how it's changed the ways we get about with our lives, it's changed how often we can see our friends coronavirus, as we have now had to be dependent on video calling with technology for communicating between each other rather than meeting up in person, especially sometimes when you can no longer person. And a lot of the things that incorporate my routine, so a lot of things that incorporated my routine has transformed drastically because of the pandemic itself. And so a lot of the things I do in my everyday lives, living with my family, that every one of us loves, just going out and about, and especially in usual weekday routine, waking up early in the morning to go to school, and then my parents heading off to work. So especially my dad, because he works for the store. My mummy still goes to work because she works as a nurse. So my routine had mostly all come to abrupt halt as a result of the lockdown. So myself, I have moved on to working from home in addition to home learning. Now, before, initially, when we first started doing home learning, we actually did that on papers, but now I believe a while after that, we had started doing it on computers. So we call it the VLE, powered by Google Classroom, and it's the virtual learning environment. And from my personal experience and perspective of coronavirus peak, I've seen how it's had such an impact on myself, my family, and so much others. And let's be honest here, it is really serious. Especially as well, my dad had to face being in hospital because of conditions. So I would like to express my thankfulness and gratitude for all that the government is doing right now to help us as a nation get through this together, along with us doing all our bits, so hand washing, distancing, masks, although it isn't an easy job, especially when you're that one person who sits at 10 Downing Street and then makes all the decisions going forward for this country. And what would make this time better for me at school is, personally for me, what would make my vision, so what my vision would look like for a frankly more superior time at school broadly from this moment and into the future. So not just for this time, but more going into the future and onwards, so in the next few months or weeks, would be to attempt to get into a game of interacting with my fellow pupils. So that was a target they had set me for this academic year. And whilst I may not have reached the goal point of that yet, that is something I wish to be able to commit to over the coming weeks and months, especially as they heavily encourage me to do this. I'm now going to be taking some questions from the MPs.
Brilliant. Thank you for explaining your situation, Dominic. That was really, really helpful and interesting to hear about the different difficulties. We have a question from our first MP, so over to Sally Ann Hart.
Thank you, Olivia. Dominic, that was really good, that all the information you gave us there. I know when we've spoken to a pupil before, a young man with autism before, he was talking about an online support group that he'd set up. I don't know if you've come across that. And you were saying that one of your goals is to become more interactive with some of your...
Yeah.
Have you come across that online support group where you can actually interact with people online with similar attributes to you?
No, that online support, no, I've not come across that website yet, and I have not taken a visit on it yet. So as far as I'm aware, I don't think I've visited.
Okay, it might be worth, Olivia, giving Dominic that information, because that I've sent it to my nephew who has autism, and I think that's a really good idea. And just one more question. Can I ask one more question? I don't know if anyone else has. Dominic, how do you feel? Are you feeling that you can cope with the changes that you're having to do? Do you feel that you're getting enough support?
Yes, I do feel that I'm getting enough support. I'm proud to be working with such a brilliant school. You know, I've been here for 3 years now. I've been studying here ever since I was in year 7. Yeah.
That's really positive to hear, Dominic. We've got another question. Just a reminder to MPs, just to introduce yourself fully before you start your question. So over to Rob, if that's okay.
Thank you very much, Olivia. Hello, I'm Rob Butler. I'm the Member of Parliament for Aylesbury in Buckinghamshire. Dominic, that was a fantastic insight into what life has been like for you. I'm really pleased to hear that you think that the school has done fantastically well. I just wonder if there's anything that you would like to see changed or improved that would make life better for students.
Don't think there's anything that has to be changed. I think current feelings just all right at the moment. Can't move. So I don't think there's a lot that needs to be changed, other than for myself, you know, building up more my interaction with people. Because there was like a consensus that we've had in our annual review earlier this year when we were in lockdown. So that was like around June. And what my class team had recommended to me when we had that annual review was to build up more my interacting with pupils, because what they think from their perspective is I am mostly more used to interacting with teachers in contrast to the pupils. So that's basically the sort of the target that they set up for me, to encourage me to socialize more pupils and then people from the same age group and things like that. Which I think is kind of a sensible, like, sort of target for me. I think it has a lot of significance in me because, you know, before I used to be quite humble. You know, I liked just, you know, having a humble run myself and just relaxing. You know, in my home for lunch and dinner, I used to just literally sit in a desk all by myself. That's how I used to eat my meals daily before. But now, ever since my dad moved into hospital because of COVID, I've now started to get into the habit where I would literally just be going up to the kitchen and then joining the rest of my family there, because that is where we as a whole family normally eat for us in my personal life. So
brilliant.
Fantastic. That's really great to hear. Thank you very much indeed.
Brilliant.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Dominic. That's the last questions from our Member of Parliament, but just one last one from me, if that's okay. How have you found the online learning? Do you think it's been useful and helpful for you, or is it less of a concern for you than the social aspects that you've mentioned?
So yeah, the Google Classroom for us, it has been very useful. You know, helps us to keep up with our learning, even though we can't go to school online. And one of the greatest benefits about it is we are now able to receive feedback from our teachers live. So before, when doing it on paper, we can be able to get feedback from our teachers on the work that we do. So that is one of the advantages of the VLE, is it has that one main important feature that we didn't even have when we did it on paper. And that was, of course, getting feedback from the teachers on the work, how you did and what you could do to make it better.
Oh, that's really interesting. Thank you so much. We're going to move on to our next speaker now. And I'm really pleased to welcome Alison Worsley, who's the Director for External Affairs at Ambitious About Autism. Welcome, Alison, and the same again, 5 minutes to speak and then we'll take some questions, if that's okay.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you for inviting us to give evidence to your inquiry today. I'm so pleased you got the opportunity to hear from Dominic first. It's really important to us as a charity that we hear directly from young autistic people, as well as kind of amplifying their voices. And so it's great that you as an inquiry and as a group have been working in this way. So thank you, and thank you to Dominic from me. Just full disclosure, the school is one run by Ambitious About Autism. So I'm pleased to hear, Dominic, that you think it's working well. But I think Dominic's experience kind of shows us that it can be very different for every autistic young person, and that as for those of us running kind of schools, colleges, education establishments, we've all had to learn and adapt very quickly during this coronavirus pandemic. So as Dominic says, we started off with kind of sending paper home, quickly trying to give our students that learning experience at home. But now we've adapted, we've managed to get more laptops and technology out to children, young people, trying to tackle some of the things around digital poverty, for example. That means that some young people might not be able to have access to this blended approach to learning, and we are progressing and we're enabling that to be interactive, as Dominic said, but I don't think it should be underestimated the challenge that all schools, whether mainstream or special like ours, have faced in trying to get this up and running so quickly over this period and with ever-changing kind of parameters and guidance. But the main things I wanted to draw on today in my evidence to you are a survey that we conducted in August and September. It had over 2,000 responses from autistic children, young people and their parents, carers on their behalf across the UK. We're going to formally publish this data shortly, so you're getting a sneak preview. Please treat it kind of in that context. We've shared some of the preliminary analysis already with government officials to help inform things like the forthcoming autism strategy and the government SEND review. But this focused specifically on experiences of young people during the coronavirus pandemic. And I thought that might be helpful to share with you today as part of your transitions inquiry. It does really complement a lot of other evidence that's out there already, things like the left-stranded report from the National Autistic Society, which we also supported. So I'm going to start briefly by focusing on the sort of education and transitions, and then talk about mental health and wider support, given the topic of your inquiry today. So as you've heard from Dominic, the changes to routines and ways of learning during the first lockdown impacted significantly on autistic young people. For them, structure, stability and established routines are key to successful learning and successful outcomes. So some were able to attend schools or colleges because they might have had an education, health or care plan. They might have been children of key workers. But schools' teaching and support capacity, the staff they had available, the measures they had to put in place to make their premises safe, the ever-changing guidance, health fears, either because a young person might have co-occurring conditions or they might have vulnerable members within their families, has meant that it's not really been a consistent offer for pupils with SEND, across the country. So as one parent put it, there have been numerous changes to routines, changing classmates and rota. My child was in a constant state of terror, hyper-excitement and not regulated. So the transition to this kind of blended learning approach, either virtual or in school, and where possible back to full-time education in this academic year, has caused considerable anxiety. Almost half of autistic children and young people were worried about not being safe due to coronavirus, and almost a third worried about catching up with work. This quote typifies the feelings that many parents have had about being left without support for their child. It's been incredibly difficult for my autistic child during lockdown, and I'm extremely worried about her return to education. We've had no plan or help in place for this. So in our survey, 70% of autistic children, young people and their parents and carers had lost sleep worrying about the return to education, and just over half weren't confident that the support would be in place to meet their needs when they return to education. And this wider support, I think, is really important, particularly in the context of your inquiry. So shockingly, 80% of the autistic children, young people and their parents told us that the support they've been accessing before the pandemic had either stopped or been significantly reduced. So this includes things like speech and language therapy, mental health support, respite care. We know the pressure that services have been under. They've needed to alter their ways of working, delay things, or remove provision entirely. So one parent told us that their son had lost all connection with day services, clubs and respites. My son has routine, but his world has been turned upside down. Another mother very sadly told us that her 11-year-old autistic daughter had tried to take her life twice in May. She then spent 9 weeks in a general hospital because there was nowhere else for her to go. That young girl had previously managed her well-being at home, and she's no longer able to do so because of the uncertainty and anxiety that this has triggered within her. So she's now really sadly heavily medicated, and she's no longer in school. So we're seeing some really life-altering consequences for children and young people, as well as those who've been able to adapt, as Dominic told us earlier. It's been widely reported, you'll have seen in things like the State of the Nation report, that there's been a reduction in referrals to health visitors, social care and mental health during that first lockdown period, and it increased steeply during the summer months. And one mental health practitioner that I work with described it as a tsunami in terms of the referrals that they've had. There's a lot of widespread evidence out there, and our survey then repeated that showed that before the pandemic, around 4 in 5 autistic young people will have concerns about their mental health at any one time. But now 63% of young people in our survey say their mental health is worse. Over 3/4 said they felt anxious, and over half described themselves as feeling frustrated, stressed, overwhelmed. And tellingly, 3/4 think that they're going to need ongoing support for anxiety or mental health issues following the pandemic. So what do we need? That's the kind of million-dollar question. We don't believe these current inequalities can continue. They shouldn't become more entrenched. And now we're in the second wave. We'd really like to see the government protecting and prioritising autistic children, young people and those with special educational needs from both these kind of short-term effects, but also the longer-term impact of the pandemic. There may well be points at which we look at reintroducing Coronavirus Act powers that reduced access to services and entitlements, and I would really urge us to reconsider doing that if that's something that comes on the table in future. I think we should also prioritise measures to tackle loneliness and isolation. Sally Ann Hart, I think, mentioned the online peer support. I think that's quite patchy across the country. We've also been funded through the Department for Health and Social Care to run some online peer support, and it has been an absolute lifeline for young people. It allows us to build autistic young people's contacts with their peers and give them some support, and it also allows practitioners like ours to make timely referrals to support services and more specialist provision. And I think our schools also need some extra support in place. Some consistency of offer and some learning of best practice from others about how to support children with special educational needs, particularly when we know such high numbers are in mainstream provision and may not have access to the same kind of skills and expertise that we might have in some of our specialist provision. So thank you very much for listening, and happy to take any questions that you have.
Thank you so much, Alison, and that does really paint a very dramatic picture for us about some of the young people's experiences at the moment. Some of those statistics are quite horrifying. I do have one question for you from Steve. Steve, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Steve McCabe. I'm the MP for Selly Oak in Birmingham. Alison, that just struck me as the sort of thing that I'm hearing from constituents on a regular basis at the moment. What I wanted to ask, and you touched on it towards the end there, whenever this is over and we go back to whatever we think is normal then, we can't go back to having services delivered as they were before. I mean, they were already grossly inadequate. And I just wondered what you thought was the best way forward. I mean, you mentioned a couple of items at the end, but it occurs to me that when the government set up the local offer, there were a whole host of promises made about the kind of services that would be made available. And in fact, you know, when I ask about the local offer these days, it looks to me like it's just something that's stuck on a council website somewhere, which you may or may not find it easy to access. Mm-hmm. And I wondered what you thought, whether, you know, we really need to argue that there has to be some statutory guidance behind the local offer, and whether we need to actually spell out a minimum set of obligations and standards that should be available no matter where you are in the country. Otherwise, it feels to me that we'll literally... my phone going off, very helpful. Otherwise, we'll literally go back to where we were before. And you know, personally, I think that's just not good enough.
I'm certainly with you on that, it's not good enough at the moment. You're right, the local offer is very patchy across different areas, and it should signpost families to particular types of supports that are available in their local area. I think part of the challenge, though, then comes when those support services might not be as readily available to local people. For example, we often hear from autistic young people that we work with that either their needs aren't great enough, i.e. they don't meet the threshold for the service, or ironically that they're too complex and therefore the service can't meet their needs, and they often get left in limbo. So it's not just about signposting to the right kind of services and information that might be there, which I agree could be improved, but there's also something about the offer that we make available. And I think you make a very good point that we've all adapted to different ways of working now, and any new services or new ways of accessing services that we've created, for example, through video or through phone, we need to be very clear that those are accessible to a wide range of disabilities, because they're not always that accessible to people with, for example, autism or other disabilities. So I would focus on accessibility and range.
Thank you, Alison. I've just got one question, if that's okay, from a member of James's Sunderland staff, I think. So is that a question from James for Alison, delivered by a staff member? Yeah, I know that's very complicated.
That's great, Olivia. Thank you, Alison. That was a great session from you, and very interesting to hear. And I think the question from James is, I'd be interested to hear your views on the need to speed up the EHCP process and reducing the waiting times for children to have access to CAMHS, because without that, it sort of seems to hold up the whole process. And I hear horror stories of children waiting 4 years, 2 years, 3 years just to get started on this process. So I'd be interested to hear your view as to what changes could be made there.
Thank you. I completely agree with you. There are significant waiting times, both for a diagnosis, then to start and go through the Education, Health and Care Plan (EHCP) process, and then, if needed, in terms of sort of a CAMHS process. So there are three different and not necessarily connected processes. You don't sort of automatically kind of transition from one to another, and that's something that we at Ambitious have thought about in relation to the diagnosis process, whether for a school-aged child that should automatically then trigger an assessment of whether an education, health and care plan should be in place. But like you, we hear horror stories all the time. Previous surveys and research that we've done shows an average waiting time of 18 months for an education, health and care plan, and published government statistics would support that. So it is a really long time in the life of a child, and actually what I'd like to see us do is put in place more support at that kind of SEN support in schools level, so that we're supporting children and young people early on, and they might not need to have an education, health and care plan. Does that answer your your question. I would just say in relation to CAMS, that's often where we also see diagnosis, particularly for girls. They might receive their autism diagnosis there because they've camouflaged and it presents differently in girls. And then it's, you know, a mental health crisis, eating disorders, self-harm, suicide, then leads to CAMS intervention and finally an autism diagnosis. So it's quite a complicated picture.
No, that's great. That's a great answer. So in summary, it's more of a joined up, consistent approach across all three diagnosis areas.
Yes, if we could get the principles of the Children and Families Act to apply, where education, health and social care truly work together and truly jointly commission services, then we'll be doing a better outcomes for our children and young people.
Great. Thank you. Alison, I've got one last question for you from Sally, who's just popped in at the last minute.
I'm sorry, but I think she sort of answered it, Olivia. It was about
that's fine.
What she'd like to see with CAMS, with education, and you've sort of more or less answered that with a much better joined up approach. I mean, early intervention has got to happen very, very much sooner than it's doing, so that the right support can be put in for all our children, let alone children with special educational needs. So thank you. You've sort of answered it.
Okay, great.
May I follow up briefly on that, Chair?
Yeah, last word, Alison, and then we'll move on.
I just think that that's, you know, a really important point Sally Ann Hart's just made around that kind of early intervention. You know, I think that might have become lost a little bit along the way when we're dealing with a crisis, but actually that's the way we will, you know, better support children and young people. And, you know, if it is an area that the committee is looking at, I know you've seen previous kind of online peer support recommended to you, but for us that was kind of one of the light bulb moments in responding as a charity to the coronavirus pandemic. This is what autistic children and young people were crying out for, some way to tackle that kind of loneliness, isolation, build support groups, and I really do think that that's something that you could look at potentially as part of your inquiry. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Alison. That's really helpful. And thank you for joining us today. That was really useful for our evidence gathering. We're now going to hear from a parent. We've been trying really hard to have everyone represented, as it were, in these speakers. So I'm really pleased to welcome Sarah Alexander, who is from Rotherham, so a fellow South Yorkshire person, and is a parent of a young person with SEND who has an educational health and care plan, and who is attending an out of area specialist independent school for the last 5 years. So over to you, if that's okay, Sarah.
Good afternoon, everyone. I know this is primarily around sort of the impacts of coronavirus on transition, and my daughter's had probably one of the biggest transitions of in life because she's now gone to university, amongst all this background of COVID, which has been challenging for many students anyway, let alone with the added complexities of having SEND. But it sort of comes in, it's exasperated sort of previous inequalities that were already there and failings in the system. So, like I said, for the 5.5 years, she'd had to attend an out of area specialist Asperger's placement, which had worked exceptionally well. But because we have no local provision to support her needs, because she's academically very able, but has quite substantial needs around sensory and speech and language and executive functioning, day-to-day living skills, and people just can't seem to comprehend that you can manage one and not manage the other, that they're not actually linked at all. And that works exceptionally well, and well, we've managed to get to a university stage. And they sort of then did a linking with a mainstream college, because what she wanted to study, she's a musician, she's a vocalist, is not available if you need specialist provision, because everybody seems to think you want to be a mechanic or a caterer, or, you know, it's very limited what your options are. But we found a really inclusive mainstream college that worked in partnership with the specialist, and it worked exceptionally well. The issue we ran into was the last year of college. She was too old to stay at the specialist placement, so it all had to go to mainstream, and personal budgets managed by the local authority for the health section, which just did not happen. So we were on this backdrop of, I was in the process of a tribunal appeal to get stuff put back into the education, health and care plan that the local authority had removed to fit provision. And then we come into COVID. So we had our tribunal, we were beginning of April for our tribunal hearing. So we had to do it we did it on paperwork. But then it was sort of too late by then to get the stuff in, because she wasn't actually ever going to go back into a college placement. So she sort of lost out on a full year really, but it was exasperated because of COVID not being able to sort of deliver that. However, the college were very good they closed about a week before lockdown, and they used Microsoft Teams, and she had regular sessions most days. They might have not been for very long, but there was that routine there, which was very much needed. And actually some positives came from that, because we found some more effective ways of support actually during that, such as electronic note taking, which has now followed on to university, because we know it works really well when the notes are taken and can be seen at the same time. So there was some good aspects to it. The university worked really well with us. They were very proactive, which was a really positive change to what we've been used to, because it's always been a fight to get anything that you need, whereas the university were much more approachable. And my daughter actually said that she felt that they wanted her, not that they were just going through the motions. But then of course disabled students allowance comes along, and we had to sort of navigate that and the different criteria. The assessment for that was quite positive actually. It was very different again to the Education, Health and Care Plan, which is very much deficit based and what people say you need, and it's about young people, whereas this was more about, well, what do you think you need? What do you think might help? Have a look at this. Do you think this would help? So that was very much more positive, but it was just sort of really strange that it's based on diagnosis and not needs to actually get the assessment. So the EHC plan wasn't really much use at that point. They wanted a diagnostic letter from 7 years ago, and you just think, well, why that makes no sense at all. And then we've sort of come across the barrier of the difference in what's classed as educational for DSA and what's classed as educational for an Education, Health and Care Plan, with the big gaping hole being for therapeutic support. My CCG won't provide an offer of the therapeutic support that's being provided through the EHC plan. I'm currently having to challenge that, and it's not classed as educational when it comes to DSA. So there's this big gaping hole that you go from one to the other, and there's no consistency there with that. So that's another sort of challenge. We also had the challenge of not being able to go and visit accommodation because of the lockdown. So she had to move into accommodation, having not been able. We did see a virtual. Fortunately, there was one online, but it's not quite the same as getting a feel for it as well. So it's been a bit of an up and down journey, really. Use a lot of the online. The students created online social groups before they got there. That was fantastic. So they'd already sort of figured out who they'd be sharing with and all those sort of things. So that was another bonus. That really helped. But the ongoing, my daughter actually contracted COVID when she'd not been at university very long. That in itself was quite challenging. And the social care package wasn't in place, ready for a move in, so I had to go and live across the road from the student halls for a month to provide social care support. So that was interesting as well. But fortunately, that's when she contracted COVID, so I was around to sort of support through that. And it's all had a really roller coaster ride on mental health. Her psychologist, funded through the Education, Health and Care Plan, did maintain for as long as she could weekly sessions through Microsoft Teams, but that all ended when the summer came around, and she was no longer classed as being in college, so that's now something that's also not being provided. So yeah, it's been a bit of, and that's just a brief description of it. It's been quite difficult, but I think she's enjoying university. The challenge living in halls of residence, they brought security guards in. That was quite scary, dictating to students, even going and checking inside their accommodation to see who they've got in there and sort of things like that. So that's not been very helpful. And the accommodation provider's not been overly great either. So it's, yeah. I don't want to just keep waffling at yourself.
That's really, really useful actually, Sarah, because I think the difference between DSA and EHCP plans, we kind of all know it's there, but you've just described it in a really clear way about the differences. So thank you so much for that. I'm just going to see if any colleagues would like to ask you any further questions.
That's fine.
I don't see anyone indicating, so I'm going to be cheeky and abuse my position as the chair to ask you, what do you think that local government and universities could actually be working a lot closer and through these sorts of issues, or do you think they're very standalone and that's a big problem that we should kind of pursue as an APPG?
My local authority have not supported us at all through any of this. The EHC team, we have no contact at all. There was no transition review, no transition plan. In fact, I had the transition review last week. She's been at university since September.
Right. Okay.
So some contact would have been really helpful. The university themselves have tried really well, and communication was really good. There was a downfall in funding from DSA because, again, it's got limits on what you can have. So the equipment that was needed went above the funding limit. But the university straight away just said, we'll fund that. And they did, we didn't even have to ask. They were sort of really proactive around all that. So sort of getting the DSA stuff, getting that in place has been really good. The big issue we do have, though, is that there's a very big onus on the student to put the support in place, which is something that she really, really struggles with. And because I'm sort of distant, I'm trying to go in between everybody and get it sorted out. But actually, it still needs her to take that leadership. It's not proactive, it's sort of reactive. She's got to sort of send everything that's needed and request it and organise it, and which is some things that's really, really difficult.
Well, thank you so much for speaking and sharing your experience. I think it's really, really helpful for us to get that fuller picture. So if you don't mind, we'll be moving on to the next speaker, and I'm really pleased to welcome Rachel Perrin, who's the Partnership Manager at the Family Fund. So the Family Fund is the UK's largest charity providing grants for families raising disabled or seriously ill children and young people.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Well, you introduced the Family Fund, so I don't need to do that. Our support's really focused on helping families to improve quality of life and remove some of the barriers families on a low income might face. And we currently support over 100,000 families with grants and services. And we've been able to reach out to our families during the coronavirus outbreak and ask them about how the impact of the coronavirus is affecting them and their children. And since the outbreak and lockdown, we've begun research with our families across the UK to help shape the support we provide, and feeding that into inquiries like this one, and also into the Department for Education's support for families. And today I'm just going to be talking to you through our research in England with families aged 0 to 25, looking at the short and longer term impact on the theme of children's emotional and mental health. So when we began our research, our aims were really to understand the effect of the COVID-19 outbreak and to understand the immediate concerns and needs of the families that we support. To date, we've conducted 3 waves of online survey and in-depth interviews with families. And our surveys began at the beginning of lockdown in late March 2020. Our second survey was then 6 weeks into the lockdown in early May, and followed by our last survey in August 2020, a week prior to children returning to school, just so we could get a real picture. And we're going to continue that research throughout the rest of the year to try to continue building a picture of where our families and their children that they support are at. So in total in England, almost 6,000 families responded to our survey, raising more than 7,600 disabled children between them. And we asked them about their child's emotional and mental health. And through our surveys, families have told us that the COVID-19 outbreak and the lockdown has had an overwhelmingly negative impact on young people, children and young people's mental health and well-being. 93% of the families we surveyed said the coronavirus outbreak had negatively affected their child's health and well-being, and that had increased from the first few weeks of lockdown. In particular, families were telling us that the outbreak had negatively affected their child's behaviour and emotions at 86% of families, and their mental health at 81% of families. People described common issues of their child feeling increasingly anxious and stressed, becoming upset and experiencing more regular mood swings and escalating challenging behaviour. I'm going to share some quotes from families throughout the research today, because at Family Fund we're really keen to share our families' voices. So families told us, it's affected my son's mental health as he had to become an adult rather quickly with no warning and look after me. He's not been able to deal with his anger and has trashed his room sometimes 3 to 4 times a week. He's thrown furniture as well and broken it. He needs a structured routine, and we've had none of that during lockdown. Another family told us, my daughter's mental health is massively affecting everyone in our household. She's regularly having panic attacks when leaving the house, and this is having a knock-on effect on things like eating. The mental health has also had an impact on siblings, and parents and families told us that 2 in 5 of them, that the siblings' general well-being had been negatively impacted on, and more than a quarter of families said siblings' physical health had been impacted. Families told us very little has been done to support my daughter's mental health and the subsequent effect on her brother and I. It's been very hard, and I'd like to have had more support. My son's behaviour has taken a turn for the worse, and this is also having a huge effect on his younger sister, who has been seen by children and young people's mental health for an appointment. She's under young carers to give her a break, as he can be aggressive towards her. My oldest child is having mental health appointments from school as he suffers from anxiety. So in general, the mental health and well-being of disabled and seriously ill children has significantly worsened due to the COVID-19 outbreak. Families told us the impact will show for years to come. My disabled child is non-verbal, and his behaviour tells us when he's unhappy or worried. We've seen lots of strange behaviour and headbutting. The lack of routine and seeing others has had a negative effect upon all of us as a family. This has made it a very difficult year. Worryingly, on the backdrop of this increase in poor mental health and well-being, our surveys highlighted that all types of formal support, treatment and therapy has declined for disabled and seriously ill young people following the outbreak. The results from our latest surveys are consistent with the 2 previous surveys we conducted, suggesting in many cases it's still proving difficult to get formal support back in place for families raising disabled and seriously ill children, even after lockdown. Worryingly, for those children who have been experiencing poor mental health, our last survey showed that children who received support prior to the initial lockdown told us over 2/3 were not receiving support from an educational psychologist. Over half of the children were not receiving support with respite and short breaks provision. Over half of the children had no longer had access to their psychologist or psychiatrist, and almost half of children who previously had support were no longer able to access child and adolescent mental health services. Families told us they were disappointed with the total lack of support for our disabled son through the crisis and having no help in managing extreme behaviour issues. Another family said, I've not been able to access any help as my son has mental health issues which he has helped with previous times. I left an email but got no help. Families also told us their biggest concerns were educating and entertaining their child at home and their disabled or seriously ill child's health and well-being. In turn, 2/3 of families told us they needed more information around mental health and well-being. So in conclusion, we see the increased pressures and ongoing lack of support is having a lasting negative effect on the mental health and well-being of disabled and seriously ill children and their families. Even if support returns to pre-coronavirus levels soon, the negative effect the outbreak that has had on the mental health and emotional well-being will take some time to recover from. And this also applies to the wider family, who without respite and support have also seen their mental health and well-being continue to deteriorate. All of this seems to suggest to us that the post-coronavirus world will likely bring a new normal in which families raising disabled or seriously ill children are even further disadvantaged. We believe that parents need to be able to access those vital children's services, therapies, and access the formal and informal support they received prior to the coronavirus outbreak. And they also need the information and support to do so. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Rachel. Again, some very terrifying and horrifying statistics, but also the testimonies that you've just outlined are very, very powerful. I do have one question from Sally Ann Hart again. So over to you, Sally, and then I'll see if anyone else has a question.
Thank you, Olivia. Rachel, that was really quite emotional hearing you say that. It's very traumatic for a lot of families, and they're doing their best in these circumstances, and it's very difficult when you've got behavioural problems and the impact that has on siblings and the whole family. So what I was going to ask you is, you're asking for the services to go back to pre-coronavirus times, but would you say there needs to be even more support given? Because when we're looking at children who haven't been in schools and how behind they've become, it's almost like there's gaps there in the months that have gone by that need to almost be filled, so that it almost, what would you say, that there needs to be actually more support to really embed the lack of support that's been, in order to help it progress into next year?
Yeah, I think, you know, speaking to families, what we've seen, and we looked at other issues where that families were facing during the lockdown, including income, savings and debt. So we've looked holistically at the need for support for the whole family. And we know that families definitely need more support around managing their household and finances. Parents need support around their mental health. I would say that we see through the research that children have definitely been impacted. We know that their learning outcomes have been impacted. Families have told us that. So children do need that additional help and support. Obviously that would need to be resourced, and we know that schools are doing their best to try and get children's help, to get the help for children back into place that they can. And we also really welcomed the announcement yesterday from the Council for Disabled Children and the Minister, which outlines how local authorities and providers can get that help back into place, but that needs to happen really soon.
Thank you. I've just got one question, if that's okay. We've heard, well, I've heard from schools that they're very concerned about the extra cost pressures of COVID in terms of just day-to-day spending on COVID, and I'm a bit worried and conscious that that might take away from some of their spending on emotional and mental health support. Is that something that you're concerned about or aware of?
Of the cost for schools? Well, I mean, we haven't done any research with schools, so I don't know if it's our place to comment. We know that the majority of our families have put their children back into school, and we have got some more information on our research. If you go to the end of lockdown, that talks about families' experiences of the support from school, and we've also got some statistics around how happy or not families were with that support that they've received.
Brilliant. Okay, I've got one last question for you from John McDonnell, if that's okay. Over to you, John.
Right, Rachel, what do you think is the reason for the lack of access to education psychologists? What is the issue there?
Well, we found that families didn't know some of the reasons why they hadn't been offered that support. There was a real variety. Some families have been offered some reduced access by telephone calls. Obviously, lots of families, children access those additional therapies that they get through schools, and as schools were closed, that meant that things like speech and language therapy, occupational therapy, access to specialist teachers of the deaf and those that support children with visual impairments. When schools closed, it wasn't just the education that closed, but it was the whole package of support around that child that children weren't able to access. So obviously that's had a huge impact. And I know that at the moment, talking to colleagues, professionals that work in multiple schools at the moment are having real difficulty getting access and being able to travel around different schools because of obviously the impact and the implications of catching COVID and then spreading that around to more vulnerable children. So there needs to be alternatives. As I say, the Council for Disabled Children just really released some information on how services at such as short breaks can be put back in place.
Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. Moving on to our next speaker. So thank you so much, Rachel, for that. That was really, really insightful. And our final speaker today is Rob Williams, who's the Senior Policy Officer at the NAHT, and who are not only the Secretariat of APPG, but they also represent over 30,000 schools, leaders working within a number of different areas of the educational sector, so right across the piece. So welcome, Rob.
Thank you, Olivia. Thank you. Just to say on the exceptional costs issue, we've got a separate piece of work that we've done on that, and when I submit the written evidence to the inquiry, I'll include some of that, so you'll get some of that detail, which will hopefully be helpful for you. I'm going to quickly go through some general observations, then a link into some of the survey work we've done with our members during this period and some broader member feedback. And then really sort of looking at challenges as we look further forward, I guess. Some of the things I'm going to say you'll have heard before from other people, I guess. During the unprecedented time of challenge that we're facing at the moment, COVID-19 has really laid bare, more than any time I can remember, some of the disadvantages that children and young people with SEND and their families face in wider society ordinarily. Accessibility to the right education, as well as the associated wider support services, can be challenging at any time for children and young people with SEND. But within a system that is predicated upon certain forms of communication, on understanding and access, this pandemic has shown it to be sometimes ill-equipped to maintain every child's right to a high-quality education. This tends to be not due to a lack of will or commitment from pupils or parents and families, nor even the schools and settings. More frequently, it appears to be due to a deficit in capacity or in resource or in the mechanisms for collaboration and understanding across a range of sectors as to what is required for all of our pupils to maintain their well-being, their engagement, their progress and learning, and particularly during this period. We've undertaken a number of member surveys throughout the pandemic to ensure we hear directly from schools and settings about the issues they're facing in trying to provide support for children. We ran a specific survey focused on special schools and alternative provision settings in June 2020, and we had over 570 SEND school leader respondents highlighting a number of areas. And this included the timing and quality of school guidance produced. 86% of respondents did not agree that the Department for Education guidance had been published in a timely manner. And two examples of that would be the September guidance for full opening specialist schools and other specialist settings, which would be critical for planning for effective transition for children and young people with SEND, was not actually published until the 8th of September, some days after the term had started. And transport guidance, which is really required by parents and families prior to any summer recess in order to establish the expectations for successful September educational transitions, that wasn't published until August, which was well after the end of the summer term, and that created avoidable problems trying to communicate with families and make sure that children and young people were well prepared. As a result, nearly 3/4 of our respondents felt that the delays in producing appropriate guidance had affected their ability to make effective planning decisions on behalf of children and young people. In the most recent updated guidance related to the latest lockdown in England, which was published on the 4th of November, there was a sense that once again, it was broadly mainstream predicated guidance, and it didn't adequately consider special schools and specialist settings needs. And it was unclear to some school leaders, particularly those supporting SEMH and complex needs, whether there was to be any further guidance released later that would better reflect the specific needs of their settings and their children. And NHT believe all the way through that such special school guidance be published at exactly the same time as mainstream advice and guidance, because the children and young people are returning or coming into the schools at exactly the same time and need that support. One of our alternative provision members, who leads a large multi-academy trust in the Southwest that provides support to enable people to reintegrate into mainstream or special schools, or they're in their last 4 terms of education, integrating into the world of work or further education. And he described an increase in the numbers of pupils with medical needs requiring specialist support, an increase in concerns for groups of students at risk of suicide, which you've heard from other people contributing, and particularly since medical provision restarted once again following online provision during the previous lockdown. An example being higher achieving students, often girls, struggling with increased pressure they now sense in terms of examinations, and the public narrative of falling behind and the need to catch up, exacerbating that anxiety for them. In terms of mental health, the initial lockdown had provided some opportunity for certain children and young people with SEMH to settle in to actually enjoy a less anxious time at home. That may have been the case so at the start of lockdown, but over time that does seem to have subsided or reduced. A significant issue emerged when social care and healthcare were unavoidably pulled elsewhere as COVID-19 took hold. And for many pupils, the impact was minimised or at least significantly reduced because schools and settings stepped into that space as best they could. However, this did badly affect pupils with existing and growing mental health issues, and particularly if they were not able to access existing counselling and other related support. And the pull away for social services and health remains to date to some extent. And when schools and settings reopen more fully in September, obviously their ability to capacity to undertake the additional social care health roles disappeared. And for pupils with SEMH, this has had a real impact. The proactive cross-sector safeguarding approach during pre-COVID times, which enables frequent, sometimes daily monitoring of such children, has not always been able to be reinstated. And as one leader said to us, when schools stop being able to deliver that support, there's sometimes nothing left to catch these children. The coordinated safeguarding approach is particularly significant for children for successful SEMH transitions. And it's also been noted that many such children and young people are glad to be back in school and welcome the re-establishment of reliable daily routines, even if they're different from pre-COVID times. Some school leaders spoke about wider community issues related to COVID-19 as well. And in some areas, there seems to be an increased issue related to things like gangs and drugs. Grooming for this activity is starting again, and particularly where places such as takeaways and so forth are reopened. Without adequate police presence, the opportunity to target such at-risk children and young people is available to criminal groups once more. And it remains unclear where the capacity and responsibility to address this type of issue actually sits. And some school leaders look at a type of combined agency approach, as schools are often sitting in the heart of the community. And therefore, should services be concentrated around that school community, exploring the potential for co-hosting of health, social services, etc., in schools and settings, as it is often a place that families come into regular contact during their child's education. School leaders, teachers and support staff have achieved some remarkable things for children and young people with SEND since COVID-19 changed schooling from March 2020 onwards. And they've put in place systems, support and processes within a scenario no one could have adequately prepared for previously. However, the exceptional costs continue to be borne by all settings and likely to be even more acute in SEND and AP due to staffing ratios, PPE usage and the intensity of cleaning routines, threaten the ability of schools to maintain acceptable levels of safety and support for pupils to continue attending. And if one thing is now clear as a result of the pandemic, it is that full, open, safe and secure schools, particularly SEND AP settings, enable public services and businesses to function more effectively, and more importantly, they provide a system within which the safeguarding, education and support of our children and young people is more likely to achieve successful transitions between and across settings and ultimately more successful outcomes. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rob. Is there any questions for Rob? I don't think we do have any questions, but that was really, really useful insight from school leaders across the sector, and I think there's some really powerful ideas around more cross-agency working there, which I think we should definitely take away and look at a bit more. I mean, that's the end of the session, as it were. So can I just say a massive thank you to all our speakers and all the MPs that were able to ask questions today. That they were all really welcome, and I think that we got some really useful information. And I'd just like to thank all the people who have been attending. We had nearly 100 people on the call today. So again, another very well attended event, and we'll be having one more of these sessions before the publication of our report. So please do make sure that you get your written evidence to us by the 15th of November this weekend, and you can find the full details on the APPG website, which I gave earlier and should be in the chat box available for everyone. Just a reminder that we can't take up individual cases of difficulties that you might be experiencing with the SEND system. You really do need to contact your own local MP about that, but please do share anything that you think would be relevant to our current inquiry. The next meeting will be on the 2nd of December at 2 p.m. via Zoom. This will be the final session, as I said, and we'll be focusing on sensory and/or physical needs. All are welcome to join for that, and the link to register is in the chat box and on the website. If you would like to speak about this particular issue, please register your interest, as we're keen to hear a wide range of individuals again, from organisations, parents and young people. The link for that is posted in the chat as well. A reminder again, finally, that we're closing our written submissions this weekend, so please do refer to the terms of reference that's been posted in the chat. And again, please follow us on Twitter at APPG_SEND and sign up to our mailing list on the website. A reminder that today's meeting is available to watch tomorrow, and the video will also have captions, so please do share that, and if you want to catch up again, please do watch it. And finally, a massive thank you once again for our speakers for sharing their stories and expertise. We're delighted to be able to give you a platform to young people and parents to speak to parliamentarians in particular. And thank you to all the MPs who attended today, and to everyone for watching. We hope you will come along to our future meetings, and thank you for today. Goodbye.